Hello. The events of recent days have triggered an incredible wave of messages on the internet and in the media. Really, everywhere, actually. Trump will betray Putin once again. Trump has surrendered to the bloody tyrant. Zelensky will outsmart Putin. Zelensky. Trump has broken Zelensky. London is outsmarting Trump. Well, basically, you could just keep endlessly repeating all this informational junk. And that's why I wanted to say a few words. I've already written about it partly, but very briefly. But I want to explain what is actually going on. In 1981, a new financial model was adopted in the West, which, starting from 1991, became the global financial model. It was called Reaganomics, and it allowed the global financial elite to increase their share in the world economy from 20% to more than 70%. This was a model of a debt-based economy, in which the rate of debt growth far outpaced the growth of the economy. In general, can we even talk about economic growth in such a situation? That's a philosophical question. When a company is in this kind of situation, we say it's over-leveraged and will soon go under. Well, basically, that's exactly what ended up happening. And then things started to get really interesting. The thing is, the financial elite, remember, they control 70% of global profits and, accordingly, a similar share of assets, suddenly realized that the tools they used to control all of this were starting to fail. Of course, this is happening slowly, it's complicated, but the fact is, it's plain to see. In general, a lot of people have started to realize this, even though at first, no one believed it. The problem here is that the elite never actually govern directly. They rule through institutions and executors, meaning representatives of power groups and hired managers. Moreover, lately the focus has been specifically on hired managers because they're easy to replace, unlike members of power groups, who are people of authority and with whom relationships are much more complicated. And, well, we actually see these hired managers both in the West and in Russia, right? When a person seems to be performing important functions, one day they're a governor, then a minister, then a deputy prime minister, then the head of a state company. And then suddenly, bam, they disappear somewhere and they're just gone. And what's most surprising, the difference, between a person of power and this kind of empty hired manager is that a person of power might seem to disappear, but then they reappear again. But a hired manager disappears, and after that, nobody needs them anymore. That's why they never come back. How many ministers have we had whose names, well, nobody even remembers anymore? So, getting back to the point. When it became clear that this financial elite couldn't keep things under control, quite a few old elite groups and new ones, especially the digital crowd, started to get concerned. First of all, about how to create a new order, since nobody is satisfied with chaos. But most importantly, is it possible to take away the assets that these finance guys have accumulated over several decades? And the conflict between the group represented by Trump and the old Euro-Atlantic elites. Now, the Euro-Atlantic elites are a collective group that controlled the issuance of money, were its beneficiaries, and consisted of the main American part, the British, and the Western European part, which was the weakest, so to speak, and, as experience has shown, basically stopped being a real player. And this conflict is absolutely natural and material in nature. In addition, regional elites have started to assert themselves, namely the Russian, Indian, and Chinese elites. Theoretically, the Brazilian elite could have risen as well, but they failed to do so. And so, conversations began. Isn't it time to dispossess them? There were several attempts which ended in failure, But now, in general, it has become more or less clear that the financial elite will not be able to hold on to the situation. And the question comes in two parts. First, how long can they last? Second, how much will they have to give up? And finally, the last thing, where will they manage to hold on, meaning in which places? For now, London seems to be the most natural option because it's already more or less clear that the national elite of the United States will clamp down on this financial elite. But accordingly, there's a desperate fight going on, including over territories in Europe, because this group simply can't give up Ukraine. The moment that happens, it will be such a symbol for everyone that that's it, Akela missed his mark, and now they can be torn apart. In other words, the subtext here is absolutely material and objective. That's why arguing about whether Trump will betray or not is a pointless question from a strategic perspective. Strategically, the forces behind him are interested in cooperating with China, Russia, and India, but on a completely different basis, not on finance. So, in general, everything here is more or less clear. If we return to the specific situation, the meeting in Alaska was an attempt at an agreement between the elite groups behind Putin, which Putin himself leads organizationally. This is what sets him apart from Trump. Putin is the real supreme commander-in-chief. Trump is not a hired manager. He is, without a doubt, a member of the ruling group, but not the main one. Although, from the perspective of the enemy surrounding him, in this sense, he is not much different from Putin. Because since the late 80s, we've seen an incredible number of enemies grow, and getting rid of them is not so easy, especially considering that they still control the overwhelming majority of financial flows in the world. And so, accordingly, this was an attempt to reach an agreement on strategic cooperation. That's why, strategically, Trump's task is to remove Ukraine from that position where he and his, so to speak, leaders are spending resources for the benefit of the hostile financial elite. But a strategic direction doesn't necessarily mean that it will be the same tactically. Right? Any road uphill can have descents and valleys. Now, here's what happens next. Trump is putting pressure on Zelensky. Zelensky fully understands that if he makes the decisions Trump is demanding from him, he won't be able to return to Kiev. Well, to be more precise, he might be able to come and then leave, but to return as the nominal leader, he won't be able to do that anymore. And on top of that, it's really hard for him because the British side, which controls and even protects him, is putting a lot of pressure on him not to go along with this. He can't refuse Trump, but he can't refuse the British either. And that's why he's constantly being offered some kind of palliatives. One of them is a meeting with Putin. Why? Because for Trump, it's important that the decisions he made with Putin are legitimized in the West, after which, at least, that front will be closed for Trump. And at the same time, this whole European-British entourage is trying to force Trump to keep fulfilling his previous commitments to the financial elites. That's what the whole argument is about. Ukraine here is just the focal point where all of this has come together. It's absolutely clear that Trump doesn't want to do this. Whether he can fend them off right now or not, we'll see, maybe this week, maybe next. It is quite obvious that Putin's visit to the EU, even to Hungary, is extremely dangerous. And it's not very clear how to do this. Occupy Budapest, or what? Well, how is it? Well, how is that possible? A. Is it possible to provide security for the Russian president in enemy territory? there is no certainty that Orban will be able to do this. Yeah. Well, actually, we saw, right, the story with Fico, where his own bodyguard almost killed him. Yeah. Well, to be precise, it wasn't the bodyguard who shot, although honestly, that's not entirely clear, but the bodyguard clearly ignored the situation. So, in short, today we've encountered an extreme escalation of the situation connected to the fact that anti-finance coalitions have already started to form. At the same time, people can say whatever they want, once again. It really doesn't matter what Trump thinks. There are objective economic processes that can't be stopped, that will continue no matter what. Once again, let me remind you, all of this could have started 5 years ago. But the financial elites, however, came to a fairly reasonable conclusion. If no one is talking about their destruction, then that means destruction can't happen, since no one can even imagine it. It was precisely because we broke up this monopoly more than 20 years ago that we have faced such intense pressure all these years. Today, this has already become the norm. Well, let's see how things develop from here. That's it. But the key point is exactly this. It's kind of like raising the interest rate. I don't really want to make any predictions. A lot of people have written about this topic, but personally, at the beginning of 2023, I wrote that raising the interest rate would lead to the destruction of mortgages as a form of social support, to the shutdown of industry, to the halt of construction, and so on and so forth. From an economic standpoint, this was absolutely obvious. But at the same time, since the financial elite controls almost all the media, this topic was taboo, and only a few people kept breaking through this ban. Like Misha Deliagen and a few others. There's really nothing you can do about it, because the financiers understand perfectly well that as soon as this dam is broken, they'll be torn to pieces. And it's not just about losing their positions, they'll be stripped of their assets. All of them. Because at first, they'll go after the biggest ones, then the medium-sized ones, and finally, even the small fry, the very ones who used to feed off them, will have their last scraps taken away. Nothing will save them. It's simply impossible, because there's no institutional support for this kind of ownership. I've said many years ago that the key feature of this crisis will be the destruction of the mechanism that legitimizes ownership. Specifically, from the perspective of the financial elite maintaining this ownership. That's the key point. So, coming back to today, I don't know how these games are going to end, you know? Will Trump break Zelensky? Or, on the other hand, will he force Zelensky to tell Trump that he won't make any deals with Russia? And at what point will the United States stop funding Ukraine? And so on and so forth. We'll see all of this unfold in the next 2 weeks. It's quite possible that there will also be political consequences from the meeting between Trump and Putin in Alaska. But let's wait until the 2nd or 3rd of September, because I think the real appointments and staffing for these meetings everywhere, both here, in the United States, and in Europe, will start after September 3rd, after Beijing. So, for these next 2 weeks, I suggest everyone take a good rest. Autumn is going to be interesting. Thank you for your attention.